I'm Alexander from Swedish alternative media vaken.se, and here with us we have Mark Anderson. So I met him a few years ago on the Bilderberg protest in Copenhagen, and he's been working for American Free Press and other outlets. And yeah, hello, Mark.
Hello, Alexander.
We haven't met in a while, but I thought it would be nice to have a chat and see what's happening in the world.
Yeah, it's the 5-year anniversary since I met you in Copenhagen, Denmark at that 2014 Bilderberg meeting. A lot has happened since then with Bilderberg and the greater deplatforming problem and social media censorship problem. And so there's much to report, and some of it actually connects to Bilderberg in more recent years.
Yeah, from many people in Sweden might not know so much about you. So if you just tell a little bit about yourself, some people have seen you on Bilderberg meetings and videos, but how do you start doing this, and what are you doing now?
Well, I actually came out of conventional media, the South Bend, Indiana Tribune. South Bend's kind of famous now because that small town, relatively small town's mayor, Pete Buttigieg, is a Democratic contender for the 2020 presidential election, kind of an obscure figure there. So South Bend's made some headlines. At any rate, after coming out of conventional media, I got into alternative media initially by starting my own newspaper, the Herald Republic, in the early 2000s. Then I picked up American Free Press, covered Bilderberg in conjunction with the late, great Bilderberg hound Jim Tucker, many years, then covered it solo since then. And I've also started Stop the Presses, which is a radio show at republicbroadcasting.org, 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. But that's also the general name of a news association that I put together where I look for the best alternative media and network to bring the best options to people to overcome the mass media cartel's grip on public opinion. So Stop the Presses is my current endeavor. And I'm also working with Jason Mangum of South Texas, a constitutionalist pastor, and we have started World Impact News, and that's videos. So Stop the Presses is mostly written word and radio, and World Impact News, or WIN, is videos on YouTube. So I've become more multimedia over the years by necessity, and that's more or less how it's went in the 34 years that I've been a journalist.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. We'll we post an article with the video later, and I can get a list of all the sites and you mentioned and the videos.
Great, no problem. Yeah, and my blog is thetruthhound.com, where a lot of this information is collected and posted, as well as on a Facebook page for Stop the Presses. That's thetruthhound.com. Pardon the slight interruption there from land. Okay.
Okay. Anyway, so the problem we have both in USA and Europe is the increasing censorship. That in USA you saw like big alternative media like Infowars got totally deplatformed on the, like, not only the big social media sites, but like probably like 25 or 30 different social media. And in Sweden, we have problems with the government putting direct pressure on Google and Facebook also shutting down some YouTube channels they don't like and putting pressure on people. And we've actually seen many of the people running this alternative media now like are based outside Sweden, like the register a company in Malta or Estonia or somewhere else to avoid trouble, and then you can register a page and write in Swedish. And so and some people who do it on the spare time and don't earn much money from it, those people easy to the platform. They just shut down their Facebook page or YouTube channel. So you now use some different media, but you also have you still work with publishing articles in print magazines. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. American Free Press is still a print publication. It comes out every other week instead of every week like it used to, but it's still pretty comprehensive. The website's americanfreepress.net. The states, anywhere, the deplatforming and the social media censorship carried out by these private big box companies like Google and Facebook and Alphabet and whatnot um, is a problem. And one of the things that I would put forth is that we don't want to lose print media altogether. It's great that we have this digital universe that we live in now. There's many advantages, but there are disadvantages to that system itself. And I would just briefly state that we need to hang on to print media. The written word should never completely be dissolved. And so American Free Press, for that reason, even though we're not weekly anymore, has hung on. It's a little bit of a tight go. It's a little bit difficult to hang on, but I think it's important to keep that in mind that the written word can make a resurgence in part because of this digital censorship, even though we still need to fight the censorship. So that's just an important lesson to heed.
Yeah, the problem I have with this censorship, it's we're not been so affected yet, but it's actually we have a lot of articles on the webpage, and we link to different interviews and like interesting talks people been doing, and then when you check through the archive and I want to like republish an article like a year later because it's still relevant, then the video is like it's not there anymore. Like it got deleted
Mm.
from YouTube or whatever video platform, and then sometime I can find it again, but sometime it's like it's not on the web at all. It's just disappeared, and maybe the person who made the video doesn't have a backup. So like very important and interviews and movies that people put time and effort on that was only published on the web, they're just gone maybe like for eternity. So it's
Yeah,
really sad at what's happening.
this is speculation, but my there's a little bit of evidence, and there seems to be more every day that Google, Facebook, Twitter, and all these big media giants, social media giants, well, for one thing, you'll notice that they all have the same views. They all have the same definition of community standards for deplatforming and censoring and demonetizing alternative voices. Isn't it funny that they all think exactly alike? And it makes you wonder, again, speculation at this point, if they're not all simply peas in the same intelligence pod. A lot of people have speculated that Mark Zuckerberg is nothing more than a front for Intel. The same with Eric Schmidt. You know, that they're just faces for people to relate to those brands, those social media brands. That is speculative now, but there's more and more tidbits of evidence showing that the reason they all seem to speak with one voice and have the same exact standards by which they judge everyone else is because they're basically outlets of intelligence. If they weren't from the very beginning, then they were subcontracted to do so later on.
Yeah, for what I understand with the social media, it's a very effective tool. It's just how society is built. It's social media seems to be very effective to change who's going to win a political race or like what company to promote. So, but I've seen it being used very effectively in these so-called color revolutions and the Arab Spring. Like in Ukraine, you had
Mm-hmm.
you even had a documentation of training camps a few months before they had a whole revolution there, like where like young people got to learn how to use these tools effectively. And back then, like 7, 8 years ago, or even 5 years ago, those platforms were not so censored. So you could have like big overthrow of governments using these tools, and it was totally free. But now, when people in the West want to change maybe government or delete here, then it's totally shut down and very limited. So it seems the whole purpose of social media is changing.
Well, there's pretty strong evidence that um, I believe it was Facebook. Yeah, Facebook was censoring pro-life voices when Ireland had a constitutional amendment that basically removed from the Irish Constitution the basic principles that prevented widespread abortion in Ireland. So whatever one might think of that issue, Facebook was involved in censoring pro-life voices, and that definably and discernibly affected that Irish election where they changed the Constitution. Now abortion is much more open-ended, like they've tried to do in the States where they'd have it at any stage of pregnancy. The point isn't so much on the abortion issue per se, but we're told that Russia is involved in altering elections when there's evidence that Facebook did have a discernible effect on that particular Irish election. So here, Facebook and other big social media are asked, sort of subcontracted or colluding with government to give government data and to carry out censorship. And yet, Facebook is carrying out censorship itself, even though they're supposed to watchdog people like you and me, Alex. So there's the hypocrisy, and there's where the fix is in. The real the real problem are the big social media companies themselves in adopting this one size fits all philosophy and basically doing in private what most governments would never attempt to do publicly. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall make no law abridging speech, assembly, and all that, freedom of the press. But if you farm that out to the private sector through these social media companies, the government can have deniability and let the private companies in the private sphere do the censoring that the government would be constitutionally prohibited from doing. So essentially, they're privatizing the control of speech, so governments are off the hook.
If you want to put this in a bigger picture, because you're an expert on elite meetings like Bilderberg and Trilateral Commission and so on, like why do they need this censorship? What is they don't want us to know? Why? How do they control the whole society? It's not only censorship. What do you think are the different control tools, the mechanisms they use, and who are they? It's like people just vaguely refer to some elite or some people go to Bilderberg meeting, but it's a long history. And what are they currently up to, like at the present?
Well, what we know now, Alexander, is of course we know that the big social media companies, Eric Schmidt, Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Twitter, as I've said, they all think alike. They have the same criteria for measuring who's good and who's bad. But we know that Alphabet, the holding company that Eric Schmidt, the former Google chief, started, gave lots of money to the Hillary Clinton campaign. So we have also the involvement of big social media giving money to the internationalist left. These things are fairly well known, and we've put that together. But then if you want to look behind the curtain further, you see that Microsoft is also involved. And in fact, Microsoft was involved at the most recent Bilderberg meeting in Montreux, Switzerland this past June 2019. And there's two groups to look out for there, Election Guard and News Guard. Now, Election Guard, we'll start with that because we didn't see that one coming, perhaps, Alexander. We know they're trying to censor the news through this privatized approach to keep the governments held harmless. At least in the States, it works that way. But then we think, oh my gosh, Election Guard? You mean censoring or controlling or meddling? There's that favorite word. Meddling in the news isn't enough. They have to meddle in elections. Well, let me see here. I'm reading from a story at thetruthhound.com, my blog. Okay. The key is, let me get this straight. The key is Microsoft. Microsoft is connected to both NewsGuard and Election Guard, and Microsoft always has, or most always has, an attendee at Bilderberg year after year. Excuse me. It used to be Bill Gates himself, as you know, Alexander. Oftentimes, though, Microsoft is sending someone else. And this past Bilderberg meeting in Switzerland, they sent the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. That's a gentleman, Satya Nadella, Satyanadella. And he evidently went for the first time. And I'm looking here. I wrote in this story, I'm trying to find the best part, excuse me. Given NewsGuard's obvious bias, and we'll get into NewsGuard in a minute, the fact that Microsoft also seeks to modernize all of the election infrastructure everywhere in the world, and that's as Satya Nadella himself boasted. that should invite heavier than ever scrutiny of both Election Guard and NewsGuard. Now, so the Election Guard infrastructure is in its infancy, but it's very troubling that both things are on the Bilderberg radar through Satya Nadella and Microsoft. Now, NewsGuard is the actual setting up of a real panel of journalists, Alexander, not relying on algorithms to look for trigger words and keywords and things like that. NewsGuard says it's different. They're going to look out for us by having an actual panel. Now, NewsGuard was co-founded by the lawyer and activist journalist Stephen Brill and a former Wall Street Journal publisher, Gordon Kravitz. And NewsGuard, as I noted, uses a team of trained journalists and experienced editors, that's according to its website, to rate online news sources, to grade them, rather than rely on computer algorithms, as I noted. And this SWAT team of news staffers with NewsGuard compiles detailed profiles, which are basically dossiers, on each news website in question. And then NewsGuard has a browser extension that acts like a traffic light. If you get red, that's a bad news site in their view. If you get green, that's a good news site in their view. And just like a traffic light, yellow is caution. So this is,
I've seen, not exactly like NewsGuard, but I've seen on Facebook that if you post a link to a particular video or article, you can get notification that Facebook considers fake news, and they base that on they have some trusted sources. I forgot the name. Usually it's a generic name like global warming facts or like healthfacts.org or something, and it's different organizations who the only thing they do is to publish their own articles with some professor saying that all vaccines are safe, or like that the humans are causing global warming, and then they go through articles posted on social media and they mark them as fake news, and that can that causes them to not be shown in people's feeds. And also, if you post too many fake news, you can get a warning from Facebook. And that's not only in English-speaking publications. I've seen this in Denmark also. New political party there, who's anti-globalist, posted about the 5G cell phone network they're building, and then one of his news he posted got this fake news warning, and it was linked to a Danish site. Something in English would be factcheck.dk, like a Danish site, and then he posted a post about that particular article, and it was just owned by one rich person who had the company based in Malta or something. And he had this site just checking facts, posting articles, and then Facebook, you think this is the trusted source for all Danish news. And if you go against this fact check site in Malta, then you're gonna be, and that there must be quite much money invested just to have this site up and running with all the journalists, checking articles and writing their own posts. And it seems there's a lot of financing going into this control system, not only in USA and in big English publications, it's also in small countries.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing. Isn't it ironic, Alexander, that we have to fact check the fact checkers? We've seen that Snopes, the so-called legitimate fact-checking website, Snopes.com, I think it is, has actually been shown to be pretty much fraudulent itself, at least in most respects. So if that's an indication of these modern day fact checkers that think they possess all the acumen and knowledge and ability to be the official fact checkers, if that's any indication, then we're in big trouble. So the irony again is we have to fact check the fact checkers. And the bottom line is that there's this status quo out there. The whole system of the world is framed in a monopoly of credit, basically financial and banking control. And that framework, that monopoly of credit, has to hold at all costs. They cannot let that be breached. And each truthful story that they want to label as fake is one more salvo, one more round launched at that framework, that monopoly of credit. and they don't want it to take on water. They don't want it to start crumbling. They don't want to have to put their fingers in the dike, so to speak. And so they have to circle the wagons and create this false narrative that they have these legitimate fact checkers out there looking out for our best welfare. I mean, how completely sad and pathetic the whole thing is. Uh, what we actually see are the elite being behind this to say they're not only going to safeguard, again, our news through this news guard in the way that I described it, but also, and it's more in its infancy, as I indicated, now election guard and electronic voting machines, the kind that are used in about 95 to 98% of all voting precincts in the U.S., are notoriously untrustworthy, where they're capable of being programmed to flip votes. You press the button for candidate A and the machine records candidate B on the inside. If they were really interested in election guard, they would have a complete overhaul of these electronic voting machines, or go back to hand-counted paper ballots counted in the open at the precinct level and counted on camera, where the chain of custody is never lost. But I digress. The news guard, which is further along than election guard, is, remember, the common connection of election guard and news guard is Microsoft, and Microsoft attends Bilderberg pretty much every year. But the election guard, let me see here. No, the news guard pedigree, the advisory panel for news guard. I want to get this straight. The 10-member advisory board includes former NATO chief Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was at Bilderberg 2014 when I met you in Denmark. He's the former Danish prime minister, and he recently founded the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, and he happens to have a residence in Illinois, USA. The Alliance of Democracies Foundation, of course, is internationalist, globalist, interventionist. Another member of the advisory board for NewsGuard, Tom Ridge, the first Department of Homeland Security secretary when the DHS was created in the wake of 9/11. And get this one, retired General Michael Hayden, the spook of spooks. He was the Bush and Obama era CIA chief, who also formerly headed up the National Security Agency under Clinton and George W. Bush, and served as the principal deputy director of all national intelligence under G.W. Bush. This is some of the NewsGuard advisory board, Alex.
Yeah, it's interesting because when most people talk about censorship, they only talk about Facebook or YouTube, like they're taking all their own decisions. But if you think a little bit further, like you do, it's and also look on the evidence and documentation, which organizations you have. There's more. It's a bigger picture than just a few people on Facebook and YouTube taking the decisions.
Right. You get this impression that it's just Zuckerberg and Eric Schmidt. Now, Eric Schmidt attended Bilderberg this past June in Switzerland, and he's been one of the most steady attendees from the high-tech Silicon Valley crowd. He's been going at least since 2013, when, ironically, when they met in England that year, there was a meeting right before Bilderberg met in Watford in the same area, and that meeting was dubbed Googleberg, and that was strictly, as some might recall, strictly a meeting of the high techies meeting right before the official Bilderberg meeting. So they kind of had their own powwow some 5-6 years ago. And ever since then, high-tech Silicon Valley has had a stronger and stronger and more identifiable influence at the annual Bilderberg meetings. And they're the young crowd at Bilderberg. As many know, the old crowd, David Rockefeller passed away in 2017. His Trilateral Commission creation founder, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was once a big official under the Carter administration, also passed away, a big partner of Rockefeller there in 2017. So the old guard, the octogenarian part of Bilderberg, Henry Kissinger's barely hanging on by a thread, they're passing away and retiring, whatever the case. And high tech represents the young face of the new Bilderberg. So that's another factor to keep in mind. But others on the NewsGuard advisory board include Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not widely trusted. Richard Stengel, a former Time magazine editor who was Obama's Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. Um, Elise Jordan, a former speechwriter for former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. She was the G.W. Bush era. And Richard Sambrook, director of the Center for Journalism at Cardiff University and a former BBC Global News director. So this is the objective news guard that's not going to rely on the algorithms, that's going to do a better job, we're told, of determining who's fake and who's not, even though, as one might expect, they rate Politico with a green light. They're all good. They rate the New York Times with a green light. They're all good, even though the New York Times should actually carry a warning label on it. It is so full of mistakes and sophomoric writing and imprecise, misleading, sometimes fake, false, incomplete news. It's so full of that that it literally should have a warning label on it. And yet, Time Magazine, or excuse me, the New York Times gets the green light, but they looked at RT, and RT was full of red flags. And I'm not saying RT.com is perfect, but what I've seen so far, in other words, means NewsGuard is totally predictable. The news outlets you think they'd give the green light, they do. And the ones you'd think they'd give the red light, they also do.
I can talk a little
So,
bit. It's not exactly NewsGuard, but what we've seen in Sweden. We have something called Stratcom, who's NATO connected, who have an office in Latvia or Estonia, I think.
name that again.
Stratcom.
Stratcom.
Yeah, it's associated to NATO, and they're like trying to influence the mass media and alternative media. It's probably like it's very similar to Newscom. They're warning about fake news is mostly against Russia, like it's against all the Russian outlets and also
Oh,
alternative
okay.
media who's they deem to be pro-Russian. And then we also have in Sweden we have like some kind of like our like the Swedish FEMA, like it's called MSB, and they hired some think tank in England. I don't remember which think tank, but it was one of the known ones, like Chatham House or one of those like more known think tanks in England. And it cost a few million crowns to write an article about this propaganda and everything. And part of that report was a site similar to ours. It's called newsvoice.se, and they used to be smaller than Vaken, but now they're like have more audience. There's a guy working with that full time, and they warned that because he was supporting he was pro-Russian. They thought, but I know the guy. He's like he put some articles from Russia Today and so on, but doesn't mean he's like a Russian agent. And they were like, and their solution for them was to try and take away the finance from the alternative media. That's how you could hurt them, because usually it's like privately run, like one or two people running a small operation, but maybe they
Mm.
still can reach a lot of people. Because to me, honestly, if you're telling like something that's truthful and interesting, it's gonna get spread somehow, even if you don't have a big company behind you.
Absolutely.
And then for us, we noticed something I assume was like part of a bigger operation. We had a sponsor like from Germany who was selling used car parts to Sweden, like at a lower price, because I guess in Germany you have all the big auto manufacturers and warehouses and so on, so you can import car parts to Sweden for a little bit cheaper than when you buy it directly here. And that we were not a big site, but that was like our biggest sponsor. Like they paid yearly, like for having ads, and they were also sponsoring different smaller sites. And then suddenly starts being articles in the big media, like owned by Bonio. And basically, Bonio got a loan from the European Investment Bank for like almost, don't remember the exact number, but it was almost £1 billion. Like, so they get funded, by big banks and so on. And they wrote articles like attacking that particular sponsor because they were saying that some of the people like running that company, they were Russians and
Ah,
businessmen. But it's like there must be like many Russian businessmen men working in Germany. It's not so strange. And they were claiming that they were just a front company to sponsor these alternative sites. But I was a big company selling a lot of auto parts, and I have friends buying from them. It's kind of far fetched, and they like had a few ads on some pages they didn't like. And then they had like a special, like a video Yeah, they made a video on the Dagens Nyheter page, just big Swedish page about this and articles. And that cost them, and the company said, we cannot advertise as you anymore. We're getting too much problems. So they stopped having ads at us. So we lost the biggest sponsor we had a few years ago. And I
Yeah,
don't,
there's the demonetizing factor there.
yeah, and
Um,
I don't think some random journalist at Dagens Nyheter would start investigating this company. I think they got the information from someone like Stratcom, I assume, because it's very like, why would they start looking into that in the first place and find out that information, like that the owners of the company came from Russia from the beginning, and make this whole, I think the media is working with the government and Stratcom and so on to like, it's like a war, they want to take out all the competition and using very dirty methods. And that's
right.
like
That's why.
only a small country like Sweden, like, and it seems probably the same in like all over Europe. So they try to control every tiny country they can.
Yeah, that's why you have this public-private partnership, this outsourcing of censorship from government, where many governments are constitutionally restrained, and handing that over, conceding that to the private sector, Google, Facebook, whatnot. And then the social media companies are the main ones doing the censoring, but then there's these weird media companies that pop up that are acting just like Facebook and Google and censoring, as you indicated, Alexander, on the government's behalf. So the government can have that deniability that I mentioned earlier, but in fact, they're colluding, the government and the social media and these upstart media companies that get all this money, and then they pick and choose the winners and losers in the news marketplace rather than letting the public choose it. So you can see how undemocratic this is amid the claims by the world elite of how much they're interested in democracy, and anyone that doesn't agree with them is illiberal and populist, nationalist, anti-Semitic, any epithet that they can think of, you know, and and so the real problem are the news guards and the election guards of the world and the social media companies. They are the problem, and these obscure media companies that get all this funding that are acting just like the social media companies, kind of enlarging their illicit mission. So there's an old saying, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Pretty thought provoking. And that's where we're going to be unless we can break through this smokescreen that they've so carefully and craftily put together.
I can let you
And
know what in Sweden they get most irritated on in the beginning, like, because our page, I wasn't with it. We started 2004, and it was more like an activist movement against
uh,
all the lies about like the banking system and 9/11 and everything that was, and what they got irritated on, because like the people who started from the beginning, and I was also active in the last first few years. We had like weekly protests like out on the streets, like handing out flyers, and we had like televisions with car batteries, so we have like broadcasting, different messages. And they got very irritated because we had these meetings and people were meeting and talking and collaborating, and also handing out flyers. Like we got like a whole special on the nightly news just because someone found a flyer about vaccines, that someone handed out. So it seems I'm not sure nowadays, but a few years ago they were irritated about this thing they cannot control. Like you cannot control people going to a street and talking to everyone passing by. You cannot control someone printing like 10,000 flyers and handing out in mailboxes in a city. So those things, they were very. We got like a lot of. It didn't really hurt us because we got a lot of attention, but they were like really upset about that. That was like something that were really triggering them.
yeah, that's an important point, Alex. The print media, newspapers, flyers in certain cases, actually congregating, having assembly, having meetings are still important. One of the things that I think is behind the curtain is they want everybody to stay strictly in the digital world on social media, because we have to be very careful here. The digital platforms and the internet that we use, and effectively and for good reasons in so many ways, can also be a trap if we only rely on that. So what you just said is very important, that people still need to grip and grin. They need to get together face to face and talk these things over. and use a multifaceted approach to getting around this circling of the wagons by the elite, trying to protect their monopoly of credit framework that I've referred to earlier, which is their ultimate control, the debt-based money system and all that. And in so doing, they have to control the narrative. And you mentioned vaccines. That's worth a quick comment. Vaccinations are another area, just like the fact that virtually all elections are stolen through electronic voting and other means. Most vaccines are harmful in most circumstances. So the whole medical system, the vaccines, the media system, to protect the monetary system, these are the holy grails of the elite. These are the areas where they simply cannot let their grip slip. But sometimes it does, and that explains, at least to a reasonable degree, this desperate attempt, really pathetic, to control the narrative through the illicit and counterintuitive means and deceptive means that we're outlining here today on your show.
I thought just a quick comment about I don't know if you follow Dr. Robert Epstein, who had a hearing in U.S. Senate a few days ago. According to him, because he studied this for many years, this manipulation by he calls it the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and a few more. And he's not supporting Trump or the Republicans. He is against their manipulation. And according to him, like in the last few elections, like the national elections, like the presidential election 2016, like the big tech companies gave Hillary Clinton between 2.6 million and over 10 million votes, depending on what methods they used and how aggressively. And he's saying that they've been using the same or similar methods 2018 elections, and also they're planning to use it 2020. And it hasn't. He suggested some things you can do to stop it, but yet no one has in USA has put in place laws or regulations to stop it. So, like 10 million votes in a close election is gonna, then you decide a winner every time.
Yeah, this ties into the money that Alphabet gave to Hillary Clinton, that issue I mentioned earlier. That's a great point. I'll look up his testimony. So many things on my plate, but yeah, this is the thing, is that the meddling in the elections is taking place through the actions of the big social media companies, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that this Russian narrative that they meddled in the 2016 U.S. election is completely, if not largely, false, to misdirect people so they don't notice that Facebook meddled in the Irish election. Alphabet's giving money to Hillary Clinton. These other companies are arranging the system, as you mentioned, to give more votes to the internationalist left, the Clintons and whatnot, as this guy testified that you referred to. See, the real election meddling, if there is election meddling, has been happening on this side of the Atlantic. At least that's another way of saying that it had very little, if anything, to do with Russia. And I'm not saying the Russian government is pure as the driven snow. They're a world power, and you have to keep an eye on them like you would anyone else. But in this narrative that we've been getting ad nauseum here in the States over the last few years, that they are the sole meddler in elections, is clearly demonstrably false. And we know who the real meddlers are. And that's the same people that are trying to say that we're fake news. So the jig is up. It's just a matter of getting the word out in a way where people see through the smokescreen.
Yeah, we're always trying to find new ways, and even if it's a small organization, we're working on our free time, and we always have to change our methods. Every year you have different censorships and different. It's not a static landscape.
No, absolutely not. I want to mention briefly that I hadn't said much about Election Guard. We've talked about NewsGuard because that's not as far along, but I will mention that about a month before the Bilderberg meeting in Switzerland, which was actually May 30th through June 2nd, the Associated Press, without citing the Microsoft Bilderberg connection, reported that Microsoft is entering the election security world, and that Election Guard consists of open source software. Breitbart picked up on that AP story about Election Guard and noted the name of the new software Election Guard seems quite close to Microsoft's partner NewsGuard. So Breitbart picked up on that, and NewsGuard being the browser extension bundled with Microsoft Edge that purports to be the judge of reliability in media. In practice, NewsGuard, as Breitbart noted, has repeatedly verified hoax Russian election tampering stories as true, while blacklisting multiple conservative news websites as fake news. So Breitbart got in on this, pointing out the hypocrisy and the misleading stuff going on here. So, yeah, we have a tricky situation, Alex, as we kind of sum up today's show, where the real deplatformers, the demonetizers, the real fake news, the real meddlers in elections are connected to Bilderberg through Microsoft and more or less cover all the major bases in the social media universe that provides the main way that we all get information around. A lot of people, of course, are going to alternatives outside of Facebook and outside of YouTube, such as DTube, and they've tried Vimeo with not much success, but there are others popping up. I won't promote or get into those much now, but there has been a concerted effort to go outside these big media companies, and some are of the opinion, and this is kind of tricky here, Alex, that they want people like you and I, just as an example, to not use Facebook, not use Twitter, not use YouTube, and get us off of their channels altogether. So they're trying to bully us, so we go to these smaller, sometimes less successful alternatives. But there's a catch-22 there. We need the alternatives, but we also need to keep in mind that we don't want to drop our YouTube and Twitter and Facebook accounts too quickly.
Yeah, I think there's a big void now since Infowars got the platform. It was a big threat to them. They had to deplatform it, so you have to fill that void, and that takes a lot of effort.
Exactly, and so they're going to want us to get frustrated and get off the main big box names in social media, so we don't fill the Infowars void that you just mentioned. And so there's a tactic, I believe, and others have cited this too, such as Patrick Henningsen in 21st Century Wire, that they're trying to trick us to jump ship on the main social media platforms and go to smaller ones where we'll be less effective. But the answer is both. Stay with the current big box names and also establish accounts and platforms outside the main social media companies. Do both. Don't jettison one to do the other. That way you're covering all the bases and you won't fall for any ploys or tricks that they might be trying.
Yeah, that's great advice. I agree on that. To sum up the interview, it's a really good interview. But what if you name a few sites and sources you use for follow USA News, like regular YouTube channels or sites, when you want to find out what's happening currently, do you have like a few favorite sites to look on, except your own ones you mentioned in the beginning?
Yeah, Patrick's 21stcenturywire.com is very good for both domestic and international news. If you want news that's domestic for the UK and international, especially in the EU realm, ukcolumn.org with Brian Garish and Mike Robinson is good. I occasionally have appeared on that show. Along, of course, with thetruthhound.com, my blog, I believe, and my World Impact News that I'm collaborating on getting started. That's just beginning to appear on YouTube. If you Google, pardon the pun, if you Google Mark Anderson World Impact News, you'll see some of the videos we've begun to produce. And there are other interesting sites, some of which I read for more esoteric intellectual exploration. They're not really news sites per se. I'm trying to think, but those are the main ones. I'm trying to think of some others.
You can send me a list later. We can put a link list together.
Yeah, we'll list some of those up later.
Yeah.
I'm very careful about that because I through the Stop the Presses Association that I started, I'm very careful in vetting the sources that I use or collaborate with to make sure the very best of the alternative media is put forth with a cross-pollination effect, you might say, because that's what's going to breach this framework that I referred to that the elite have erected so carefully over the last few centuries.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's important to gap. There's been a kind of a void between USA alternative media and people in EU because all the censorship, like a lot of platforms just disappeared, and then it's hard to recover. So it's good to start building relationships again to get to know what's really happening in USA. Even in alternative media, it's hard to find the really good sources.
Yeah, there's another I'll mention quickly. Recenter TV, RECENTR.com, I believe it is. It's a TV type format like ukcolumn.org, and that's by Alexander Benesch in Germany. He does a very respectable job in both German and English on his blog, and I've done some Bilderberg videos for him. So the good vetted alternative media, like ourselves, if I may say, is growing. We're associating and we're becoming more effective. We're going to keep our conventional platforms. We're going to get new platforms, and we're going to forge ahead because that's what's going to make the difference. And as long as we stay the course and remember that print media still has its place and we still need to get together in person, then I think in the end, will prevail because their house of cards is very, very fragile, and that's why they're being so desperate and completely ridiculous in the way that they are.
Yeah, they're spending like a million times more than alternative media is just to keep everything in check. It's
Yeah,
like
just to keep their boat afloat. That's right. Yeah,
it's like billions and billions and billions. They're like to keep this thing going. Yeah. But thanks a lot for the interview. It was we had Mark Anderson here for like almost an hour. It was great talking, and we'll put an article and post a video later. And we keep in touch and see how things are developing.
absolutely. Thanks, Alexander. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.